Mr. Abubakar.
Ranking Member Bass and members of the subcommittee, thank you for affording me the honor to testify before you today and to share my personal observations regarding the impact of sanctions on the ground in Sudan. My goal is to provide you with the evidence that you need to act. You have statistics and you have social aggregate data.
If you could
And you
just
have,
suspend for 1 minute, and I apologize for
Sorry.
the rudeness of it, but Mr. Garrett does have to leave
Yeah.
to meet with the Japanese ambassador, but really wanted to just express a few thoughts and maybe ask a question, and then we'll go right back and take as much time as you want.
Sure, and I apologize specifically to you, Mr. Abubakar, because I need to hear what you say. I'm going to take the testimony notes back with me. This is a very important subject to me by virtue of some of the activities that we've engaged in that we alluded to earlier as it relates to the release of some prisoners currently held in the Republic of the Sudan. And I really want to also tip my hat to you, Mr. Detoni, Mr. Brooks-Rubin as well, Ambassador. Your boss is Frank Wolf, or your former boss, is a really fine man who I think served Virginia and our nation very well, and it was my honor to count him among a distant circle of friends. What I heard here, and I would welcome the input of anyone, maybe I heard what I wanted to hear. My efforts reaching out to the embassy, the ambassador, and the Republic of the Sudan's delegation here in the United States have been obviously with a clearly articulated goal, and that is to win the freedom of these individuals, and even if it means that they leave the nation. We've obviously engaged in a relatively one-size-fits-all series of sanctions, and certainly for well-articulated reasons here today. The question that I have is, and I think you touched on this towards the end of your testimony, if we might not be well advised to try to find that carrot as opposed to the stick, even in very limited measures. What I've seen in my very micro interaction is a desire for an improvement in relations, a willingness to be accommodating as it relates to moving in directions I think we would all find desirable where they feel it's in Sudanese interest, right? And I understand human nature is motivated by, I'm willing to do this if it's the right thing to do and there's something in it that helps me and my nation. I think I've seen that, and I hope, obviously President Bashir's been there for a long time, and certainly for 11 years in one iteration, and since I guess '89 as president. But with the cessation of active hostilities, and certainly the dialogue that I've heard, the good faith comments that have been made to me, might it not make sense to slowly start to roll back sanctions and see if we don't see commensurate continued behavior? Is that, I mean, I understand the history, and certainly Darfur is something that the world can't turn a blind eye to, what's happening in the Nuba Mountain region, what we don't even know. But might it not make some sense to try to sort of give a little to see if we can get something that's in everyone's collective best interest? And Mr. Brooks-Rubin, you, I think, are moving to speak.
Thank you, Representative Garrett. I think your point is well taken. I think the important issue to note is that that's, in some ways, that's the five-track process that's been put on the table. The comprehensive sanctions, I mean, the five-track process, unless it's completely amended and tossed aside, you know, I think we're recognizing that that process is underway. When that is completed, at whatever point, and those tracks should be honestly assessed, but at whatever point that happens, the comprehensive sanctions that are in place now being lifted, that's a significant carrot. That is a significant development. That takes away all of the restrictions that are in place now with respect to imports, exports,
Not trying to be rude. My understanding is that we anticipate the lifting of the sanctions based on the actions of the previous administration if the current administration agrees to it, and that's all up in the air. What I think Mr. Detoni, and I'm not trying to argue with you because I think we're on the same page here, suggested is if this is done in a sort of progressive step-by-step fashion, it's let me paraphrase a better political figure than myself, trust but verify, that if we give to the Sudanese things helpful to the Sudanese and continue to do so long as they behave in a manner such that we find to be more consistent with the spirit of human rights, then everybody wins, right? My experience in a vacuum has been wonderful, but I know there's a whole lot bigger world out there. But it was an all or nothing, more or less, all right? The previous administration said this is what we're going to do. We're on a 6-month clock right now.
It's all or nothing in terms of the sanctions for what is a limited set of actions by the government. I think what all of us are saying in different ways is we need to get the important issues, the key issues of peace, human rights, religious freedom on the table, and then that's what we need real incentives for. And there are other incentives that are still on the table, as Ambassador Lyman noted, with respect to debt relief and state-sponsored terrorism. But our view is, if you're going to put really the rest of the issues on the table, those core issues of human rights and religious freedom, that can't just be without pressure. There also need to be a different level of pressure to get there. And so it's a sort of different idea around what those sticks are. The stick we have now is a sort of big blunt club from 20 years ago.
Right.
Let's come in with more precision-guided tools that can
And
get
so
there.
we say, show me, and what I've heard is, and again, I'm looking at a tiny little slice, we want to show you. And I think if I can build on that for a moment, if you look at certainly there are self-inflicted causes for your famine in the South Sudan, but if you look at infrastructure, and who has access to the Red Sea and ports, et cetera, and rail facilities, albeit one's in dire need of some maybe U.S. assistance if everything goes well, it would help us to have a good relationship with the Sudan to get the food to the places that don't have.
If you could just, out of respect for Mr. Abubakar, I know you have that.
Yes, sir, and I apologize to
And
all
I
of
would
you
ask all of you to circle back to the questions, and they're great questions that Mr. Garrett has asked. But we'll maybe complete Mr. Abubakar's testimony and then come back,
Well,
because I know you have answers to these questions.
So, but I guess if the Sudan plays ball, to use a colloquialism, it would be in the best interest of the entire region by virtue of just the ability to distribute food, et cetera.
I think that,
You can nod,
yeah, okay, go ahead.
shake your head no.
I don't wanna be-
I don't want to interrupt. I mean, it's just Chairman, and you haven't spoken, so maybe we could talk in private about this, not on the
I
record.
would invite
I'd
you,
be-
anybody at the table to reach out to our office. I'd love to speak with you, and I
Okay.
apologize to the
And,
chair.
and for the record, come back and answer those questions.
Sure, sure.
Mr. Abubakar.
Thank you, I'm sorry. You can't.
My goal is to provide you with evidence that you need to act. You have statistics and you have social aggregated data, and you have political knowledge. What I want to give you is my story. My name is Muhammad Abuobakr, civil and human rights activist from Khartoum, Sudan, born and raised. Inspired by the International Declaration of Human Rights, I've done the best I could to be there for those deprived of these rights the most. At an early age too, as Sudan has that tendency to force children to grow up way before they should. I grew up and spent most of my adult life in a comprehensively sanctioned Sudan. It wasn't an easy experience by any means. As a citizen, I struggled, and as a student, I suffered. The unintended consequences of sanctions that plagued the program put a heavy load on the average citizen of Sudan, and an even heavier load on the back of civil society in Sudan, and specifically on those of us in the humanitarian and human rights sectors. Despite the exceptions made for organizations working in this space. While I personally have been outspoken about these unintended consequences and joined the calls for reformation and modernization of US sanction policy, I did not for a second doubt the importance of having them in place, or the rationale for their imposition. It wasn't hard to notice the strong correlation between the regime's financial comfort and violence. So against many of our personal interests, citizens and civil society, we supported the sanctions. We believed they were about bringing positive change and transformation of the human rights scene in Sudan. And holding on to the hope for the light at the end of the tunnel, we fully complied and fully backed the sanctions. So you can imagine the deep sense of sadness and betrayal widely shared by many upon hearing about the US intentions to ease sanctions and on these conditions. Conditions that completely ignored the human rights and for the citizen of Sudan who suffered in silence for so long. In my written statement, I argued against the rationale for easing sanctions against Sudan and whether sanction relief was warranted to begin with. And I argued against each of the conditions set forth by the US government for easing of sanctions. I argued against the legitimacy of Sudan as a partner in the war against the Lord's Resistance Army and its methods, while the government of Sudan and affiliated militia are still engaged in recruitment of children in the exact same fashion. And I argued against Sudan being a part of the solution to South Sudan crisis, as that situation in that violent kleptocracy needs a serious international long commitment in building South Sudan's non-existing institutions. But none of that is as important as what I'm about to say. After the European Union recently dropped the ball on its commitment for human rights by striking an ethically and morally questionable deal to stop the African refugees and economic migrants hailing from Africa to reach Europe, and hired the very same Janjaweed militia that killed hundreds of thousands of people in Darfur, now rebranded as the Rapid Response Force, there is absolutely no other champion left in the corner of those of us in Sudan fighting for human rights and dignity for the human of Sudan. The flame of hope is fading away, and the way I see it, it's up to the United States and up to this committee to keep that flame alive. I see my time is running up, and allow me to close my remarks with this. In the process of thinking what to do with Sudan and thinking of what conditions could have been better for sanctions relief, please put yourselves in the uncomfortable shoes of an activist for human rights or a journalist who dared to speak truth to power, one of the thousands and thousands unlawfully arrested, tortured, and worse. Think of what would make things better for them and others like them. Think of me and the thoughts coming through my head right now. And the scenarios, and the very plausible scenarios playing in my head as we speak, about the consequences of me coming here today, for me and for people I care about and love back home. It certainly would have been nice if the conditions for sanctions relief included language that would make me feel a little less worried and a little more at ease. Thank you so much.